In a representative democracy like the Netherlands, we think there are two main mechanisms by which people can interact with the political system. The first is through voting, and the second is through monetary access, whereby that can be things like lobbying power, as well as being involved with your local congresspersons, or rather, sorry, member of parliament. I'm stuck in the United States. For that reason, we propose the motion. We think we're going to do this in a, as the motion stated, proportional way, but also in a progressive way. So, if you make €20,000 a year, then you're going to have to pay 0.5% of that income in order to achieve an extra vote, for example. However, if you make $200,000 a year, you might have to pay 5% in order to achieve the same amount. So this mechanism would be progressive as well as proportional. I'm willing to entertain any questions, but I think that's fairly clear. That being said, our roadmap goes as follows. First, we're going to apply a strict democratic principle to this motion and model, and then we're going to talk about why we think this brings benefits to the people that we care about most in this policy, who are the young in society and the most poor. No, thank you. First, on being democratically consistent with our principles. So we outside government recognize that the process of democracy itself is important. It is for this reason that we do have mechanistic processes to filter and change democracy. For example, the Netherlands has a proportional representation system rather than a directly democratic system. Why do we think that this is so important? The first reason is because we recognize that democracy is the only mechanism by which people can achieve their own physical autonomy and govern themselves and have government as consented to by the governed. We try to do this in the least restrictive mechanism, in the least restrictive way possible, which is why we allow for people to be able to vote in their own system, in their own country, so that they ultimately have choice over their bodies, and to also justify other attempts at restricting their liberty that are necessary and inherent to democratic and governmental structures. The second main reason, though, is because we recognize that no one group can ever be perfectly able to attain and amass the preferences of the entire population, but instead that we best ought to aggregate those. In addition, we recognize that individuals on their own tend to be more irrational and self-interested, and the aggregation of such preferences generally produces a better aggregate for the whole than for the individual. As a consequence, we are concerned about making sure that this process is fair, because the mechanisms that I described to you earlier in my speech, that is, through voting and through money, are both really tilted in favor of those who are the most well-off in society. All power, we think, is economic first and foremost, and comes from that. So the people who have more money are literally the only ones who are able to engage in one of the mechanisms I prescribed to you about how to engage in the political process, but also are more likely and more able to do things like get access to voting through the access to things like voting booths, but also being able to take off work, so on and so forth, be willing to engage in the political process as a whole. So I think what we ultimately give people is a sort of optionality. So right now, someone who makes $500,000 a year is a lot more likely to give political donations and access to the political system than someone who makes $20,000 a year. The reason is because every dollar is marginally less important to the person who makes $200,000 a year. So I think what we give people is who are generally poor, who make less than income, the ability to actually protect themselves and get engaged with the democratic process, give them the option to, where they wouldn't have before. So I think this is a much more preferable system. All right. That being said, we think there are two main groups that this actually affects. I'm going to go through each of them. The first are the very young. The reason why this is the case is because we are focusing on earned income rather than wealth. This is important because it is generally the wealthier in society who are older, that is, they aren't making income, however they still have wealth. In this regard, it's the younger who benefit from the system because they're the ones who have larger incomes relative to the process. So, we think that the reason why it's so important to prioritize young people, in addition to all the systemic barriers that they often face, is because they ultimately, generally, like if you prioritize things, will have a greater say or have a greater influence policy will have greater influence on them as they live generally longer lives rather than other persons. However, we would also note that what happens when you have a system that generally is biased towards the old, no thanks, it's actually really problematic policy. So look, for example, to places like Florida in the United States, where because the old are much more politically engaged, what they have is a disproportionate effect only on issues that affect them. Like, for example, pension policy, where that might not be good for the entire system,
So-
or instead, like housing policy, a policy that affects those who buy homes rather than those who rent homes, who are much more likely to be used. I'll take a POI from that half.
In your own words, you say above $200, every dollar means less because you have a lot of breathing room after that and cash laying about. So who has more breathing room to buy more votes, the rich or the poor?
So we think that the poor get more votes because they have proportionally larger votes under this system, or rather it's proportionally cheaper to access those votes. So I don't think that's actually going to be a problem. The second main group that we think this affects are the poorest in society. And we tell you that these are the people who are worse off, who you should care about most as a consequence in making sure that they can access the democratic process. Why is this? So we think it's because that what often happens, rather, how does this happen? We think the first way is because people are much more likely to receive tangible results. So right now, it's really hard and really skeptical of an individual to donate to their local member of parliament's campaign. For example, where is that money going? How efficacious would like my €5 be in affecting a given parliamentarian's campaign? However, there are direct tangible benefits to the individual for them because they directly see their votes becoming larger in this system. So controlling for all incomes, people are much more likely to end up engaging in the very first place where they would not have otherwise. So that's much more preferable. The second reason is quite an intuitive one, which is that it is progressive. So for every marginal dollar they give, they're much more likely to have a bigger effect than it is for the most well-off in society. So they feel like they are empowered and like they are able to have influence over those who govern them. However, we would also note that these types of general elections, like the one that's happening in March in the Netherlands, are most important for these individuals because there's often the only time that they get to interact with the political process, rather than, for example, during non-election seasons when it's only the most rich and influential and special interests who have access to influencing campaigns at all. So what we have, I think, get into fundraising or lobbying. So I think what we have under our system is a system that prioritizes those who are traditionally left out of democracy, especially ones that often be, especially a proportional representational system like the Netherlands, so proud to propose.
I'd like to thank that speaker very much and welcome the leader of the opposition. What just preceded me is a description of a system that sounds pretty broken and describes the exact reasons why votes would be bought off the very people that they think are most disengaged and least able to have any impact or trust in a system that doesn't work for them. What are the problems here? First, we support and believe in the existing restrictions in the Netherlands on large amounts of donations and on the ability of large donors to influence politicians. We believe, if anything, those should be stricter. Secondly, we believe that the proportional representation system that exists is most vulnerable to being made more extreme and forcing the majority of the population to deal with the politics of extremes at both ends, and the poor and young people that they talk about are likely to be stuck in a cycle of disillusionment with their votes that means they never re-engage in exactly the way that they want them to. 3 issues in this speech. Firstly, how this corrupts the principles. I'll deal with kind of what was said by the PM. Secondly, how this operates in terms of who and why is purchasing these votes and why that makes the system more extreme. Lastly, I'm going to talk about why this is worst off for vulnerable populations in the Netherlands. So, to the first point, which is why this system is broken, why the principles are broken in many ways under this system. The first thing to say here is that this distorts a system that is working counter to many of the problems he wants to describe because of the way that proportional representation works, which means that the kind of influence of money that has more influence in, say, the US, where you have a winner-takes-all system, or in the UK, is quite different in proportional representation, when it's harder to do things like gerrymander, and when individual electorates or small populations, like minority ethnic groups, are more easily represented under the proportional system. What does that mean? Because that doesn't necessarily stay the same if some votes are taken by other people. What it means is right now we have a quite good level of representation, but it's also easily distorted by a small population of people who can buy votes to inflate that small perspective, which means that they get rid of the benefit of representation that actually does exist despite the descriptions of their problems and inflate the problems of having more extreme politics, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Secondly, they said money is in principle justified. I've already dealt to some extent with this. We would say, first and basically, where money distorts a political system, we should seek to limit its impact and not cede to it and give into it, and that's realistically what they're doing, that we support other restrictions on how much money can go into that system. Thirdly, that the explanation of why many poor people are disillusioned with this system suggests why they would not trust the system or want to buy votes or believe that that power actually could have an impact on that system, not why they would actually buy any votes. We think all those problems make it principally unjust and doesn't deal with any of the issues that we talked about. Okay, second issue, how this operates and why it makes politics more extreme. The first thing to say here is who is actually purchasing votes. So our closing said something, but I'm going to say a little more in this speech. A couple of things. First, large amounts of poor populations are at the point where a $400 bill would put them into poverty and make them unable to pay that bill. What that means is, no matter how small or disproportionate you make the percentage, people would have a margin of wealth above what they need for their needs when you're talking about actual poor populations. So that's the kind of people they're talking about. Secondly, the amount of liquid wealth and the ability for you to increase and manage your wealth rapidly escalates the more wealthy you are, which means that people are then able to coordinate, more able to have wealth to spend, but also people who are wealthier or more connected and politically engaged are more able to coordinate the buying of these votes in such a way that would make them actually have an impact on an election, rather than being sporadic and displaced votes, which would not have the impacts that they're talking about. And the people who are likely to organise those things are existing large political organisations and machinery, not the kinds of voters who are currently disengaged or not participating in the system, which means those people are unlikely to buy it. We additionally think, particularly in the Netherlands, this applies to migrant populations with very limited wealth, who are unlikely to have existing links within that system that allow them to group together to buy large amounts of votes, even if they did have that wealth. Secondly, the people who are likely to buy these votes are not the majority population who sits somewhere around the centre. There are a couple of reasons for this. First, even if this isn't true, their system has very little impact. So if this is just people in the middle buying other people in the middle's votes, it has little impact. Secondly, it's likely people on, for instance, the far right of growing extreme populism and groups like Geert Wilders' anti-Islam Party for Freedom in the Netherlands are likely to buy votes because they can't get other popular support, but they do have something like 1 million votes, which if you inflate it by just being able to buy 200,000 extra votes, that's some percentage points that put them in a place where other people have to negotiate with them to get forward in a coalition. That kind of rising extremism has huge impacts that are inflated by the existence of a proportional system. That means you don't have to buy enough votes to outright win, just to put you in a negotiating position where you matter to any coalition that could possibly form. What are the impacts of that? Even where they don't have an overriding impact on policy, they dominate the discussions about what politics should look like. You have majority party leaders who are forced to negotiate with and put them in senior positions, and the people have to talk about those kinds of policies. Even where that has no actual impact, the dominant position and sight of these kinds of leaders has an impact on how people perceive politics to be, and the unjust way you think that people are actually negotiating and what parties are getting in power. That has an impact on the exact kinds of disillusionment that they talk about. No thanks. All right, lastly, why does this worst for poor people and the kinds of vulnerable groups they talk about? First, in rebuttal, this assumes that these people would buy votes, which is untrue. If they're in fact disengaged, they're likely to distrust the system. Even if they trust it to some extent to buy wealth and they have that wealth, it's more likely they would do that in donations that can, for instance, buy a speaker, or they can see support that actually goes into people, rather than this abstract version where people often don't understand where their votes are going or what actually happens. This closing have one? No, right, opening.
Okay, you tell us that it's really bad when the far right, for example, are able to negotiate in these processes that they wouldn't be able to before. But I think you're making a mistake. That it's actually because the center parties never negotiate with the far right, they get emboldened because the political system consistently excludes them.
All right. Center parties have a difficult time forming a relatively centrist popular coalition at the moment. They have to negotiate with some parties further to the right or left of them, respectively. Those are exactly the kinds of groups that have the incentive and ability to build up a margin of votes that makes them a necessary party in that coalition that is bad for the reasons that I just described. More substantive on why this is bad for vulnerable groups. This is likely to entrench a cycle of disillusionment where other people buy your votes, and that means the political system is less representative of you, so you're more likely to see the money as more valuable than a vote, which means those populations are likely to enter the system fairly easily and then continue to sell their votes because they have no impact. Even if those groups weren't getting policy through, their engagement and potential as a voter bloc that could vote forces parties to at least advocate them to some extent, rather than assume that they will sell those votes. Secondly, this encourages voter suppression rather rather than involvement strategies. It encourages you to make it seem like these populations have no realistic stake in them, like you will exclude coalition partners who come from these groups to make it seem more appealing relatively to sell your votes, especially when you're already quite poor and that money means more to you. We think those kinds of tactics are what mean that the parties never reach out to these kinds of people, that makes them more likely to sell and be disinterested, and makes that system less representative. This empowers the worst elements of the system to cry. We absolutely oppose that.
I thank that speaker very much. Welcome the Deputy Prime Minister.
Xavier told you very clearly that in a democracy, we think that the balance between money and physical votes has been skewed in a direction that is harmful to preserving the principles of democracy, that is, that everyone has their voice heard to some degree. Given that that is the case, all our policy proposes to do is to swing the balance in a progressive manner to enable the people who are less privileged and who are less able to interact, either both directly through financial means or by simply being able to engage with the political system due to like having to work all the time and not being able to take part in fundraisers and activities like that, to be able to engage more with these processes in the times in which it is most relevant, i.e. during an election cycle. First, a clarification, and then we go through some of the things. So, opening opposition seems to be seems to be envisioning a weird model in which you are buying votes from other citizens in your country. That is not what the model says. It says you are buying votes from the government. Therefore, all of their arguments about how the poor get disillusioned because they're going to accept $400 in exchange for giving up their vote simply don't apply, right? Like, we're still going to engage with the arguments about disillusionment, but generally just a clarification that that is not the model, and that is not in the spirit of the motion, right? These votes are going to be bought from the government, not from other citizens. Therefore, disenfranchisement does not occur in this sense. But what did we actually talk to you about? So first, let's talk about the idea of like where this money is actually going to be interacting, both during the election cycle and in the year's interim, right? Because I think this was an important analysis that came out of Xavier's speech that didn't get addressed. What we are saying is not just that rich people are able to lobby and donate directly to campaign finance during election cycles, but rather that in the general, throughout their entire course of their lives, in between elections, they're more able to influence politics in many ways. That is to say, they have more power over regional governments or elections that happen in less like in less than the whatever the general cycle is. That also means that they generally lobby more and have corporate interests that are often interacting with the government in different ways. What this means is that the rich and the powerful in society don't simply interact with the government and with the political process during election years, but it is important to note that for the vast majority of the working class and the young, election years are the only time in which they can interact with the political process. What this means is that the people who we are concerned about and empowering in this situation are the people who we think are going to be the ones to be able to buy these votes in a time in which otherwise they would not be able to exert their influence. This is where the progressive part of our policy comes in, because it's not simply a flat proportion in which the rich individuals can pay the same amount of money for a vote, but rather they will be paying a significant chunk more money, right? So in our system, people who are earning less than $100,000 might only be paying the equivalent of 30 or 50 euros for an additional vote. Not right now, but people who are extremely wealthy will have to pay a lot more money. We think this evens out the scale in a way that is not true in the status quo under the system in which they are defending, in which rich people generally have not only larger access to being able to lobby and to do things like that, but also have more money to do so. Mifzal.
So just to draw a parallel, in the status quo, taxation is progressive, but the poor literally can't spend money on campaign contributions and the rich disproportionately can. Why is the situation any different in this circumstance?
Sure. So we think that the people who are actually most likely to buy these votes are not the hardcore poor who are like scraping day to day for their paychecks, but people of the lower middle class, right? These are the individuals who we think that actually push for the same policies that often benefit the hardcore poor the most, i.e. they're the ones who advocate for things like public infrastructure, better jobs, better education, investment in things like that. So we think these are the individuals who are actually more likely to donate. And this is where Xavier's analysis about how these people are less likely to spend on things like donations to particular politicians or lobbying in general, and more likely to actually buy votes is really important, because even if these people in the status quo have the financial ability to donate 10 euros, they don't do that because they are unsure of the impact that 10 euros actually has on the electoral process. This is especially important because in a proportional representation, in a country with proportional representation, every vote does count, and every citizen is aware that every vote does count. That means that given equal amounts of ability to spend, they are more willing to spend on buying an actual vote on our side of the house than on on donating to campaign finance and to political lobbies. What this means is that we actually get more people spending their money and being involved in this process, even if they're individuals of the exact same income level on both sides of the house. But what we think we would do is encourage people of the lower middle class and the middle classes to be more involved, to spend their money a little bit more, which will ultimately benefit not only them, but the people whom they often help with their political advocacies, i.e. the poor. Now I want to deal with this argument that now that we sort of segued into who is actually going to be the ones who are buying the votes, I also want to take this opportunity to rebut the argument about extremism that comes out of opening opposition. So what they tell you is a direct contradiction. First of all, they tell you that the people who are most able to coordinate these things are parties with large machineries, right? This is necessarily going to be the two largest centrist parties in the Netherlands right now that are forming the ruling coalition, i.e. Labour and the VVD. This directly contradicts their argument that extremists are the ones who are going to be able to organize the amount that would suddenly be able to take away a significant number of power from these two parties. We think that what is far more likely to happen is that these two centrist parties are always going to be able to buy more votes and use their machinery to bolster their influence and make sure that they are protected spheres against extremist parties. However, we do think it's really important to balance the fact that these voices in extremist parties will be heard to a certain extent, and we concede that, but we think that is a good thing, as Xavier tries to point out in his POI, because we think that a system in which people feel like they're being systematically excluded by financial and political elites often leads to more social unrest and more dissent and more extremism coming out in things like vigilante justice, terrorism, and hate attacks. We think that all of that is probably diffused to a certain degree on our side, but we think that we would still be able to preserve the centrist element because these parties necessarily have larger machineries. But now I want to talk a little bit about the young individuals, and I think this is really important and has not been tackled so far by the LO. The reason that I think this is important is because we give you a principled argument about why you ought to prioritize the interests of the young, because they are generally less involved in the political process. They are working, they're not retired, and they're not able to join their neighborhood associations and things like that. They're also just have less wealth to spend because they're oftentimes paying off debts and taking on mortgages and things like that. What this means is that if you give larger amounts of votes or larger ability to the young to actually buy more votes, because they do actually care about the political process and to a certain extent are civically engaged in the actual election cycle. Look at, for example, the number of young Brits who voted to stay in Britain. We think that in these circumstances, it is not a political disengagement that is the problem, but rather a lack of means to be able to influence the process. What this means is that on our side of the house, people actually parties are actually forced to be more responsive to the needs of the young and are likely to invest in things like education and job creation as opposed to the interests of the old, which often tend to be, as they point out, more extreme and more stuck in the traditional mindsets, right? So we think that on our side of the house, we actually get better progressive policies that don't simply talk about pension funds and retirement funds, but rather things that actually affect people on the ground and help the people today. Well, at the end of the day, we think that the kinds of policies that are more likely to come out on our side of the house are policies that help the lower middle class and the middle class, spilling over to the poor, and especially, however, help in things like job creation, housing, and education for the young.
I'd like to thank that speaker very much and welcome the Deputy Leader of Opposition.
Pretty strange for a team that wanted to champion the rights of youth to decide that the best way to increase their say is to make votes tied to wealth, when by their own analysis they say most young people are poor and in debt, which means they have negative wealth and limited means to actually do this. In reality, what this proposal looks like is wealthy people with large amounts of liquid assets, that is things like stocks or just sitting on large stockpiles of savings, will be able to use that savings and weaponize them against whatever political current they want to stop. That's a reality of proposals like that undermine what is, in my regard, one of the better democratic systems in the world. That's what opening opposition stands against. I'm going to do a few things in this speech. Firstly, I'm going to take them at their very best and say what happens, even if they're right, that the poor get more votes, why does this not get the outcomes they want? Secondly, I'm going to talk about why the far more likely, and in fact only outcome, is that this will be used by the rich and very extreme. Then I'm going to look at other impacts, particularly on the incentives of political parties, how that changes the conduct of elections. Okay, let's look at this. At best, they say the poor will get more votes. That firstly undermines much of their own principle point, because what they have to prove then is that there's some sort of net equalization if they want equal access on the lobbying impact versus the poor get more votes. We think the likely response from the wealthy, who by their own analysis have far greater access to political lobbying and to political elites, is that they will drastically increase the amount of money they spend on that lobbying and spend it on donations and things like that, which means that they'll be in the ear of politicians much more, which means they will set much more conditional limits on the sorts of funding they provide, that they will lock out those parties from their donations and harm them in a way that's much greater. We note, right, that the voting population of the Netherlands is about 10 million people. So if 100,000 poor people buy a vote, but equally rich people spend $20 million, right, we think that equalization occurs pretty strongly. But mechanistically, for that side to work, poor people have to be willing to spend their money every election, right? So I'm buying votes for each individual election. They don't stack up and I don't get them individually. What Emma told you, though, is that wealth continually entrenches and extends its inequality over poor people, which means the wealthy can continue to spend more and more on each election. CF all American elections where wealthy donors have drastically increased the amount of money they've put forward. That is to say that even at their very best, the poor's votes will be overwhelmed by the contributions of the wealthy, who will also buy votes, and they will not have the equalising effect they've sought to prove. But what is the most likely example? Because listen to the logic of this side, right? They go, decreasing marginal utility of money means the wealthy care less about each individual dollar. Secondly, older people and more conservative people are more involved and typically have more wealth. And then the conclusion of that is, therefore poor people will now get more votes. It literally makes no sense, right? To convert wealth into votes, they need to be liquid assets. Most poor people have their large portions of their income tied up in goods and services and subsistence, or in housing, right? So for instance, myself as a student in Australia, it's like 75% of my income goes to housing. No matter how much I hate the Conservative government of the day, it's choosing between food or votes under that side. But equally here, we told you that cyclical entrenchment of wealth means wealthy people can continually monopolise and use their advantage, right? Thomas Piketty literally wrote a book on it, guys. That's why using wealth as the metric you want to peg it to, even if you use your slightly tricky proportional model, has none of the saving grace effects you thought it did. But thirdly, consider which groups in society have the greatest ability to coordinate and organise, and that is the wealthy, rather than the very disparate and disaggregated poor, who often vote in very divergent ways, right? It was asserted that poor people are typically left-wing. We'd say CF the American election, where huge numbers of poor people voted in a way of racist backlash and elected Donald Trump. It's very unclear as to what the net effect of more poor people voting under that side will be. We say that it's arguably the most radicalised, who have the best interest and incentive to do so. Second question, the principle. They said, we need to aggregate views and represent all. They asserted this isn't happening, which ignored, as Emma told you, the features of proportional representation that are so crucial, that it means every vote literally counts compared to the electorate system I live under, where it doesn't matter what my vote is, because the electorate votes the same way every bloody year, right? Practical democracy, as opposed to principled democracy, is about compromise. And yet proportional representation is the best satisfaction of preferences as it exists now. There is no inherent need to corrupt that system by allowing people to buy more votes. But importantly, this corrupts the principal legitimacy of democratic societies, right? Liberal societies are built, and state legitimacy is built on the consent of the governed. That consent is degraded and eroded the more you allow wealthy people, or in fact anyone, to buy more votes and gain greater influence, which challenges the legitimacy of election results, which challenges the legitimacy of policy deliberation, and massively marginalises people, which flows quite neatly to what impact will this have. But before that, someone. No, okay, what impact will this have? Question to ask, who will use this? And this is about incentives on political parties. Because it's unlikely that political parties that already have broad-based support and are quite effective at each year-on-year election at getting more votes will pursue money for the sake that 10 million people vote regularly, so you need a lot of people to buy votes to have any more substantial impact. So that means groups like the Labour Party or the Party for Freedom and Democracy, the two largest centrist parties of the Netherlands, are unlikely to use this to the same regard, because the way they succeed is through mass popular appeal and going after votes in regular elections. The people most likely to do this are those that find they have very minimal or little support within democratic populaces. Does anyone have a POI? Yes?
Yes, so if the impact of that is that people who are traditionally excluded or feel excluded from the political system have to engage, even if they're far right, with the political system, isn't that a good thing?
know when they cooperate and collaborate with the wealthy to erode the preferences of migrants and the poor and use that to gain extra influence than they already have. We don't think we need to appease the extreme right in the way that you might think we do. But this is the thing, right? Gert Wilder's Party for Freedom will go after wealthy donors because that's the way they can get more votes, because their racist message sits very poorly against the large migrant population of the Netherlands and the general left-wing tilt of this country, right? But here's the incentives on political parties. Firstly, it massively encourages financialization and seeking of resources rather than direct engagement with the most vulnerable. That's because, as I've said, the wealthy already have good reasons to have good mechanistic reasons why they can buy more votes, which shifts the way policy preferences will now cater more directly to the wealthy rather than to poorer, because it's much more useful for me to say this is in the interest of the wealthy, i.e. cutting corporate tax or income tax, because that is a way that they can operate during elections. But even further, we think this encourages parties to pursue voter suppression to proportionally increase the value of each additional bought vote, such as, basically putting forward very aggressive anti-Islamic messages and anti-migrant messages as Gert Wilders does. The conclusion of this, at the end of opening opposition, is this massively exacerbates existing asymmetry and harms the countervailing force that proportional representation gives to migrants and the poor and to women, who will all be locked out of the system and proposal of the government bench for all those reasons we opposed.
Panel, in a political landscape like the Netherlands that is dominated by coalition parties that largely meet mostly in the middle, the worst case scenario is not what opening op tries to paint to you, that like maybe a right-wing party gets elected and that's bad for the poor. Because recognize that most parties in the Netherlands are themselves like pretty pro-welfare and largely similar in their policy. So I don't think that they get to have that type of bad scenario of like lots of wealthy voting, because really it hardly changes the outcome of policy in the way that they want. The worst case scenario for the Netherlands in their current electoral system right now is to have Geert Wilders actually be a dominant member of their election. I think that it's going to happen unless we enact this policy. That's what our entire extension is largely going to be. So we're going to talk about stopping the rise of populism, why it's important, why only this can do it. Before that, just a few pieces of brief refutation, and everything else will be interwoven. So we hear out of all of openings, like, this is going to lead to disillusionment because lots of poor people are going to think that, like, because of this policy, their vote doesn't matter. Recognize that I think right now, a lot of the time, the poorer populations are in themselves disillusioned, and the reason isn't necessarily one that they root themselves in. I think that it's actually because there are a lot of people who vote, and they don't really have any effect personally to themselves for the policies that they vote for or against. I think that usually when those people vote, they have the same weight in their voice as someone who is voting against a policy that might actually really hurt them. I think that's where just disillusionment in people who are getting hurt actually comes from. Knowing that even if they vote against a policy that's actively hurting them, someone who's barely affected by it can just thoughtlessly vote in a policy and they would have the same vote. I think having some control, having the ability to put even some of their nominal wealth towards trying to make sure a policy that hurts them doesn't happen means that more poor people are actually going to be engaged in the political system. I also think that you have more incentive to buy votes, even if you have less money, if there's a policy that's going to be actively hurting you. So I think that, yes, you are definitely going to be seeing more disengaged parties engage themselves in the political system. That being said, let's talk about stopping the rise of populism. But before that, just off the top, I think that it's probably an awesome benefit on Gov that we just get to enlarge the tax pot of the Netherlands a lot. No one really said this, but I think it's good. Also, given that the Netherlands is in itself a welfare state with a really good welfare program and a lot of systems that allow for this type of money to be disseminated to the poor already, and generally a political landscape that supports that, I think that that's probably just good for the poor. So even if we buy the whole, what I'm assuming is going to come out of the op bench, that it's unjust that rich people get to have a little bit more to say, I think the trade-off of giving poor people tangibly better lives is probably good. Happy to stand on that principle. All of that being said, let's talk about the rise of populism. So firstly, why is this actually just the most important thing in the Netherlands right now?
What information?
No. Recognize that Geert Wilders right now has enough of a stakeholding in the election because he is becoming something that needs to be reckoned with in the right-wing coalition system. In order for the right-wing parties right now to form a government, they're going to need the support of Geert Wilders because they are not big enough on their own. Why is populism bad? No. So firstly, like, racist. Like, they're obviously bad and they lead racist, anti-Muslim rhetoric. That's bad. But secondly, just like, they support, like, Geert Wilders supports like international withdrawal and Nexit. That's probably would be bad for like the stability of the EU generally, and then also like strict austerity measures that are really bad for the poor. These are all things that a populist party supports, and Geert Wilders has been able to inject into the political spectrum and discussion for the sole reason that he is currently necessary for the other right-wing parties to form their coalition. Like, how does this now fix that? So, now, the other right-wing parties can campaign to their voters to buy votes in such a way that they no longer need the support of Geert Wilders. Why is this going to be effective? Firstly, because rich people hate populism, right? Recognize that rich people are largely benefited by having like free trade economies and like the EU. A lot of the time, they are against populism, so they are likely to then buy themselves votes, just such that they can like vote against Geert Wilders or vote for the parties that aren't Geert Wilders, just to get him out of the political spectrum. But also recognize that there are also like traditionally partisan right-wing people who probably don't like the fact that Geert Wilders has been corrupting the narrative of the right-wing party to be standing on racism and terrible rhetoric. I think that there are a lot of people, exactly like the Republican Party in the States, that don't like that their party is being stolen by someone who is extreme. I think that that's probably then going to mean that you're going to have a lot of other traditional voters who are willing to buy more votes just to block out the more extreme iteration of their party, such that they can get back to what the original party used to stand on. The other thing is just like, it can now be campaigned as necessity both from the right and the left wing, right? Like, they can easily say like, look how bad Geert Wilders is, buy votes so that we can box him out. I think that that probably then means they're going to have more people net buying votes against Geert Wilders than Geert Wilders having support, especially given that his party is largely supported by like blue-collar workers. I recognize that I think that they just generally have less ability than probably the rich people who would be anti-populism. I think the result then is, that firstly, you get a right wing that is now able to distance itself from being tied to racism and populism. I think that that's probably good for a number of reasons, right? Firstly, it purges the political landscape of having to have racist rhetoric that is perceivably seen as a political opinion. I think that that means that you now have less legitimization of racism in the political spectrum. That means that racism doesn't just come up as something that can be intellectually discussed anymore. It's just seen as something that is supposed to be boxed out and not entrenched within a party. But also now, right-wing parties can get back to the debate of like right versus left-wing policies and what is actually better. I think that that then means you have more voters who are engaging with the ideas of like, okay, how can we best help the poor with a right-wing policy or with a left-wing policy? I think that that means that you have less inflamed politics that surrounds itself around getting angry and engaging in like racist chants. You have now politics that can actually engage with like what is better for people, this or that. I think that that's probably generally better. I think freeing the right wing from the holding of Geert Wilders and other extreme populist groups is always going to be good. I think that in the long term as well, this is always going to be a thing that is able to do, because always there is going to be an extreme minority party that can probably then be boxed out. The other thing is that I think that oftentimes, given that there are limited rich people, you are likely going to have campaigning to middle-class people as well, and middle-class people oftentimes buy and vote for like left-wing parties, which oftentimes are in support of things that help the poor. I'm super happy to
I'd like to thank us for the short speech and welcome the member one.
Do you want to use my debate keyboard?
No,
You join?
yep.
The closing opposition will also take the government bench as its best case and assume that potentially that poorer and lower middle class do in fact get the votes that they want on this side of the house. But before I do, I think it's important for us to actually acknowledge that we're doing the even if in our extension material. But preceding that, I don't think the government bench has ever proven to us down the line in this particular debate that in fact, whether or not the rich individuals will be not unable to dominate the political discussion on this side of us. Literally, ladies and gentlemen, before I get to that, and all my rebuttals will be integrated in regards to whether or not we get less moderate politics, whether we can animate liberals, and or who is more animated in this particular debate, ladies and gentlemen, dealing directly with closing government. Firstly, I think it's important to point out that the only responses that we get from the government bench in regards to whether or not the rich will be able to overtake the poor in regards to buying it, firstly, credit the opening opposition, we've already pointed out right from a point of information in Prime Minister that with more money, you have more cash lying about, savings or stocks, ladies and gentlemen, being able to liquefy that and be able to spend that on those particular votes, ladies and gentlemen. The poor probably in being apathetic and having less cash laying about just numerically aren't able to purchase those votes as well. The only response then becomes that, now when you have certainty that your vote will actually be able to impact the political discussion or the political proportion, as pointed out by Marina and later on in the closing government, you'll now be more animated in terms of spending that money towards getting your votes. We don't think so, because literally, ladies and gentlemen, this argument has to be contrasted with the thoughts within that particular voter as to whether or not somebody else will be able to spend that money as well in this particular circumstance. If a poor person who literally, their lives are almost always defined by the desperation and poverty that they have, that they languish in, ladies and gentlemen, and the people that you're talking about, people who are angry, people who feel that they've been screwed over by the system and are apathetic about the system. These are the exact same individuals that are going to be able to be very transparent, be able to look through this system very transparently and say that, yeah, probably I'll be able to buy more votes, but a person with billions of dollars, a person that literally will be able to, for example, 12 donors that are able to match the like millions of donors by Bernie Sanders for the Hillary Clinton campaign is going to just do it all over again, because the billions of dollars they have lying about will be able to match that as well. We don't think you'll be able to balance out those legitimate expectations from those voters on that side of the house. We think they thoroughly lost that clash down the line of this debate. Now, to be generous with the government bench, let's go on to even if they get more votes on this side of the house, why do I think that firstly is going to disproportionately impact whether or not you have the rich manipulating extremist views as the opening opposition alluded to? I'm going to tell you why is it that the rich find it so easy to manipulate the poor in the current system, ladies and gentlemen, even though they have more votes on that side of the house and empower those extremist rhetoric. And secondly, I'll tell you why there's less incentive to moderate when it comes to these particular political parties when you can dig down in one particular area for votes. The first thing, ladies and gentlemen, is I think it's important to note that the kind of workers that they're talking about, lower middle income individuals, poor individuals, white collar workers, are the firstly most easy to tip towards extremism in these particular contexts for several reasons. The first of which is that these are the individuals that are animated by the anger of blaming people, like for example, immigrants for the loss of their jobs, refugees for taking up resources in their welfare state, ladies and gentlemen, anti-elitists, like for example, supranational bodies like the European Union for screwing them over, for example, when they have agricultural subsidies, agricultural limits on subsidies and things like that, when their state wants to help them out. For example, ladies and gentlemen, these are things that animate conservatives or people who are white-collar workers that oftentimes are disenfranchised by the current system on that side of the house, ladies and gentlemen. This goes further than that, considering that these are also the voters that are oftentimes more susceptible to advertising and political messaging. They have less access to resources and information and are oftentimes the least politically engaged group on this side of the house. The comparative is the liberals or the progressives or the people that you're talking about in the closing government that wants to balance out these particular things, because apparently the closing government presumes they'll be able to weaponize this on the liberal end as well. But this doesn't occur because oftentimes, liberals and also progressives as well, people that live in urban areas that are not white-collar workers, are the hardest to animate into political action and buying more votes on this side of the house. That's why you see that the youth voters are oftentimes the most progressive and liberal, but oftentimes have the lowest amount of voter turnout because they don't have the animation or the incentive in order to purchase your votes, for example. Or liberals or richer individuals don't have the political drive because they are not animated by the same anger and xenophobia as people like, for example, white-collar workers, in order to do things like purchase your votes on this side of the house. That means the political parties that end up wanting to appeal to, for example, urban areas, more progressive individuals, liberal individuals, ladies and gentlemen, find it a lot more difficult to animate and galvanize those voters in comparison to being able to galvanize people like, for example, the far right and people who are white-collar workers and disenfranchised by the current system, ladies and gentlemen. We think that's exceptionally important that that imbalance exists on this side of us in terms of political incentives. But before I go any further, I'll take opening.
Hi. Given that we propose an aggressively progressive system, wouldn't you support a system that makes it more expensive for the baby boomer generation with accumulated wealth and pension funds to actually buy votes relative to the young people, given that these people are generally more liberal and less xenophobic?
No. So, for example, I would support more tax or an inheritance tax, or just taking away like wealth in that have a wealth tax, like Thomas Piketty said, for example, or like the closing government said, isn't it nice that we have a little bit more money in a tax fund? No, just tax them as opposed to get money through the system, ladies and gentlemen. So, moving further, ladies and gentlemen, now that I've established that given that they're the most easily manipulated due to the galvanization of anger as well as, for example, the little political engagement that they have, ladies and gentlemen, the people that are most able to capitalize on these particular groups are the elite rich, or for example, the xenophobic in this particular debate, ladies and gentlemen. Just because a person has small political support right now doesn't mean they are backed with large amounts of money in order to be able to capitalize and be able to have political messaging, political advertising, the ability to manipulate those particular individuals into voting exactly against their own interests on this side of the house. Because like it happens right now, ladies and gentlemen, it's not as if the poor are helped by the policies of Geert Wilder or, for example, Marine Le Pen or Donald Trump. But people still vote against their interests because they are able to be manipulated by people with money that are able to message them and be able to manipulate them through political messaging on this side of the house. Why is it that after all that, ladies and gentlemen, you're out of order, after all that, it is now, there's an incredible incentive for the poor because you have a better return on investment. Not only can you manipulate the poor based on the messaging that you introduce them to and the political airspace that you messaging that you introduce them to, now you can also influence them to spend money that they don't have in order to get more votes, to vote against their own interests, to ensure that you can dig down and be extreme and galvanize anger in the rural parts of the Netherlands in order to make sure you get more and more votes in those particular areas and make sure that extremism benefits you at the end of the day. Thank you.
I'd like to thank that speaker very much and welcome the governor.
Alright, I'm going to start off with 2 points of extraneous rebuttal to opposition, followed by 3 broad themes. I'll tell you the titles of them once I get there. But first of all, to just talk a little bit about disengagement, especially the previous speaker talked about this, but op teams seem to be implying that if people perceive the system as one which is controlled by rich, they'll be disengaged, they'll be less likely to vote, they'll be shut out of the political process. A few responses. First of all, this is uncomparative to the status quo, where poor people are the ones who tend to vote the least and are the most disengaged right now. We say that at best that continues on their side of the house, but also on our side of the house, we think that if there's a greater perception that rich people are able to buy votes, this might actually lead to like lower middle class people wanting to vote more or becoming more active in trying to petition their government or to vote themselves. I'm not sure disengagement is what's going to win the round for op, right? But secondly, I don't think people vote often strategically or rationally, at least in terms of numbers, right? People don't do the math and be like, oh, there's like 10,000 people who are going to vote and they're each going to have 500 votes, so like it's going to lead to this and I'm not going to vote. I think that oftentimes people tend to vote, like they feel like they're going to vote anyways for a party with which they're strategically aligned that is mitigatory to the disengagement point as well. But also, we think that it could be also true that like middle class people who, for example, oppose austerity or whatever, might become more engaged with the political process and use the somewhat wealth that they have to buy more votes and vote against the parties which opposition seems to think are so pernicious because they're on the right wing, right? So I don't think disengagement is something that they have proved fully. But the second point of the extension that we just got is essentially that rich people use their wealth to trick poor people into voting against their own interests, and this is furthered on their side of the house. This is unresponsive to the argument that my partner gave about why rich people tend to not support the types of populist policies that are pro-austerity and that type of thing, right? Rich people tend to be in favor of globalization. They tend to want free trade. They tend to resent the stability and image problems that are associated with someone like Geert Wilders being elected, so I don't think they would actually spend money in this way. Especially because in the Netherlands, even if you are a rich person, you tend to support a party that, although it is on the right wing, it is still generally pro-welfare state and is generally pro-helping the poor. So I'm not convinced that in the context of the Netherlands, this actually matters that much. But also, I'm not actually sure what the harm is of poor people so-called voting against their own interests if the entire premise of OP in the first place is that poor people get less of a sway in the political system in the first place, then I'm just not sure what the impact is, right? But three themes broadly in this round. First of all, who will buy these votes? Secondly, the benefits of additional tax revenue. And thirdly, a little bit more on populism. So who will buy these votes? Firstly, from the top, I want to make very clear that in the Netherlands, absolute poverty is not a huge issue. It exists, but it is a relatively robust welfare state where most mainstream political parties are in favor of high rates of taxation and high spending that in general leads to poor people having a pretty good social safety net. But secondly, even if we buy their analysis that the super rich buy tons of votes, we still say that they cannot outweigh the middle class, because even if the middle class can buy less votes per person, there are far more than them, so I don't think the rich are the only ones who dominate. But furthermore, as my partner tells you, to the extent that rich people do get a larger say, they generally vote for the main centrist right-wing party, right? This is already a party that under status quo forms the government or forms a key part of a coalition about 50% of the time. I'm not sure what the harm is. The next point we would say, though, is that people who are likely to vote are those who are most impacted by the political process, and this includes many members of the middle class or the middle-lower class. It's true that they have less disposable income, but the general lower middle class person still has some. So if you think a party is going to come in and take away your kids' schools or take away your job, you might spend some money to buy additional votes to keep them out of office. I'm not sure why that's not the case, because there's a huge alignment of interest oftentimes between middle class voters who want parties who support schools or healthcare, and poor voters who want more money being spent on unemployment insurance or helping the homeless people or that sort of thing. And finally, we think this is likely to increase engagement from people from the lower class because they're likely to want to spend money to vote if they perceive that the rich are going to have a ton of money and vote them out of office. Opening.
We told you more extreme voters are much more likely to be willing to spend their wealth to buy votes and coordinate compared to the majority complacent centrist voters. But either way, you force parties to seek out donors rather than policies that apply to the apparently left-wing majority. Why is that better?
Here's the issue, right? You guys say populist parties are more likely to be willing to spend money to get their guy into office. We tell you that by your own admission, the people who are more likely to gain influence in politics on our side of the house are those who vote against populist parties. If you buy that for the reasons that my partner gave you, then that literally does not happen. You get a reduction in populism. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But overall, in terms of who buys these votes and who gets more sway, I'm actually not sure what either op team's worst impacts are, right? Either it's a right-wing party gets in, which I don't think is necessarily the hugest harm because it happens regularly in the Netherlands anyways, and right-wing parties are almost always at least a minority member of the coalition, or their worst case is politics shift to the right or shift towards donors overall. But I think this is just a case where they're overstating the potential impacts of this, right? We don't think you're going to see the fading of the welfare state in the Netherlands. We don't think this is all going to go away. That even in the worst case scenario where slightly more right-wing policies get enacted, we don't think it is worth it for all the reasons of reducing populism that we gave you, right? Second theme, briefly, benefits of additional tax revenue, right? If this policy is impactful, then you have to pay a decent amount of money to get your votes in. What this means is that the Netherlands has more money to spend on poor people. right? Like, this money is not going to go directly all towards policies which benefit rich people. The right-wing parties or the centrist parties that get this money will probably use it to like avoid having to make unpopular tax cuts or unpopular tax increases or like doing more spending that helps the most vulnerable people. That is a unique benefit. So that is mitigatory to the fact that rich people get more impact because the government also has more money in the first place, which can be used redistributively. We say that's a good thing. So then lastly then, on populism, which is I think where my partner provided a lot of analysis already, right? Populism is generally supported by less wealthy people who wouldn't be able to afford so many additional votes, and more wealthy people oppose populism because it's generally bad for business and they benefit from globalization and free trade and those types of things, right? So on our side of the house, you re-strengthen the traditional mainstream right-wing parties who would prefer monopolize the discourse of the right in the Netherlands, right? Op's issue is that this policy somehow shuts out the poor, right? But that's not the debate currently happening in the Netherlands political context. The 2017 election is considered a referendum on populism, a referendum on Geert Wilders, right? So if you reduce populist appeal by allowing people to pay to like vote against these populist people in the first place, this gets us back to the traditional debate of like right versus left wing issues that we see should be the debate in the Netherlands. Very happy to propose.
I'd like to thank that speaker very much and welcome the Osprey.
At the start of this debate, there seemed to be a large clash in closing heart, particularly about whether or not this creates more extremism and the rise in populism. We think specifically, we don't think closing government get their benefits because all they're able to prove was that there's some avenue for other right-wing parties to be able to access a voter base, not that it'll be effective and not that there'll be political incentive for them to move away from that coalition if it won't be effective. That means that if they continuously believe that Geert Wilders' party is more popular, have voters that are more likely to buy more votes, that means that it's unlikely that all other right-wing parties within that coalition will move out of the coalition, nor will there be any incentive for them to moderate the way that they want. Realize that they only show us there was a way, not that that way will be effective, nor will it lead to political incentive that will lead them to that decisions. We don't think that means that they get their benefits. So firstly, let's talk about whether or not there are less incentive for political parties to moderate, what Mif already told you, right? So Mif told you that it's far better if you as a political party in this political system, for you to enrage your voters, make them feel more afraid, use the rhetorics of fear or hate in any way that make them feel either threatened or afraid to a point where they're willing to buy votes. This means that an average voter will not buy votes unless they genuinely feel threatened, afraid, fearful, or genuine hate for a particular individual, particular group of people, or a particular immigration policies, and so on. That means that the way in which politics works, that we would say that happens under their side, say it's far more likely that politics will be a lot more hateful, a lot more angry, because the only way you're able to get voters to want to buy more votes is to invoke an emotion within them, either to invoke anger or hate or fear within them. So it means that it's far less likely that all the politicians will vote to the will appeal to the sensibility or the rational within every individual, because that wouldn't get them to have voters to buy more votes, because they're not as enriched and not as likely to be able to pump that much money into buying more votes and that's voting for them. We think that's extremely problematic, right? Because our status quo realize that there's an incentive to moderate, because there only is a limit in which you're able to access a voter base that's angry, a voter base that is anti-immigration, a voter base that's racist, and so on. At some point, you as a right-wing party would have exhausted that voter base and have to appeal to the moderates in order to gain majority, and have to appeal to those on the sidelines or those individuals who are liberals and turn them over to you to be able to convince them that it's personal interest for them to vote for you. But at this point, under their policy, policies, there's no reason for them to do so.
Yeah.
In fact, there's reason for them to not do so, so they ensure that their voter base will not want to buy more votes, to ensure that their voter base are enriched enough that they buy more votes. So it means that Realize has literally no incentive for any political party to moderate under their side. The harms are very clear. If you have like right-wing political parties like Garrett Wilder become more extremes than they are currently, they'll only hurt minorities a lot more, only hurt individuals in those areas a lot more, and create more hate. But no thank you. Secondly, we also think political party will be much more divided. That means that there are no reason for them to have for two political parties, for example, to want to come together between the left and the right. Because if they do, that's a concession, which means that most of their voter base will either be less enriched or less attached to that political party, which will mean they lose more votes. Because people now will buy less votes to vote for them. As opposed to under status quo, where coalitions have benefits in which you have you access two different voter base. Now it's not about the amount of people you access, but how enriched the people your voter base are for them to be able to vote for you. That means that there's no reason for you to come with another political party, find solutions that benefit the larger majority, and in the end make Netherlands a very, very good country. So we think that's very bad in that most political parties will always be directly opposed to each other, as opposed to always coming to solutions as to policies that will help a large majority of people. No, thank you. So let's deal with this idea coming from opening government that was about the lower income individuals, right? They say that the lower income individuals are more likely to buy votes than donate to campaigns. We say perhaps, but we've already told you if they don't believe that they can outvote the larger, wealthier majority, then they probably wouldn't buy those votes as well. Secondly, realize that this is a very small minority of lower income, in which is a small minority that literally have some interest in welfare yet have money to buy votes. That's a very strong people a very small population that you want to bench your case on. We don't think that's a good thing, right? But also, we told you that even if they're able to show to us that the poorer individuals will be able to get more votes, we tell you that even if they don't get their benefits, because the rich people will still be able to manipulate their votes. That means that the problem that they initially characterized about the rich individuals being able to manipulate the votes of the poor by things like lobbying and donating to campaigns, if they don't disprove that, that means that the amount of votes the poor individual have don't actually relate to them having more rights, or you don't fix the problem under status quo. Since under status quo, the middle income and lower income are already the majority, and the rich already have the ability to manipulate their votes. That means that they really needed to prove that there wouldn't be a problem under their current model for them to be able to claim that more votes from the poor will be a benefit. Go ahead.
Yeah, so you talk about fear, but small donations to Planned Parenthood from the young and this tiny middle class that you talk about, right, went up by 900% in anticipation and fear of a Trump rule. Why doesn't this fear that you talk about work in the opposite direction, galvanizing a check against great founders?
Look, we think that it's far more likely that an individual or a small group of people voting against a particular policy wouldn't galvanize as much hate or as much fear as a group of people actually angry against an immigration policy and so on. You can see this because the rise of populism is far more likely in comparison to the rise of the liberals, right? We think that's extremely problematic under their side. But also realize that it's far more easier for the rich to galvanize the poor. Why? Because it's harder for them to galvanize individuals who are privileged into action. It's something that Mifzal already said, that then said in the POI. So we think it's very important to realize that if they don't prove that the poor will not be manipulated and they don't get their benefits, at the end of the day, net more votes doesn't mean that they have net more rights, that they're not able to prove that benefit. We're extremely proud of those.